Dear viewer, get ready for an epic adventure. You will see today a crazy story about the smartest scammer in history. This man's name is Frank Obagnell, and his story is so unbelievably strange that he is considered crazy. His story was turned into a movie, one of the most famous films produced by Hollywood. The movie's name is Catch Me If You Can, and it was released in 2002. Frank's history in the field of fraud and deception began when he was 16 years old, in 1964. At that time, Frank ran away from home after his parents' divorce. He headed to New York City and was trying to start a new life. He started looking for a job, and although he found a simple job where he worked for several hours a day, he was unable to achieve sufficient income. Life was very difficult for him. Despite earning some money from his simple job, he was unable to fully meet his needs in the expensive city of New York. Due to his young age, he believed he would not find opportunities for higher-paying jobs. However, he appeared older than his actual age and was also tall and did not attend school. At that time, some rumors began to spread among the other children that he was a teacher at the school, because his birth date mentioned on his license was very close to his previous birth date. Frank's birth date was mentioned as 1948, but he changed the number 4 to become 1938. Therefore, his age appeared to be 26 years old instead of 16 years old. He began to apply for the same jobs and businesses he had applied for before, but this time, he was getting much higher salaries because of his age change that he deceived people with. This was the beginning of Frank's first fraud and scam in his life. However, his new income was still not enough. One of the things Frank did to survive was to use his checkbook as part of his plan, and he had savings from the money he earned during the summer jobs he was doing. Sometimes he wrote checks and withdrew them from his account to make up for the income shortfall he had, which was about $20 to $25. Of course, at that time, the value of the dollar was almost 8 times its value today due to inflation rates. However, the amounts were not very large, especially considering that he was living alone and without financial support in an expensive city like New York. Frank used to start by sending checks to banks, but after a while, the checks started to bounce back and be rejected by the banks. Companies send checks to the central bank or the responsible entity for the verification of checks, and then return them to the companies, informing them that they are forged. Of course, not all banks that Frank used to use accepted these checks, so he had to transfer them several times from one employee to another in each bank, until he was able to settle his affairs one day. He was in a hotel and saw a flight crew consisting of a pilot, co-pilot, and 3 or 4 flight attendants. He was impressed with them and began to think about how to travel and stay in different parts of the world for free. He thought that it was impossible for anyone to reject a check in any bank he enters while wearing a pilot's uniform. Then he contacted a famous airline company called Pan Am and told them that he was an assistant pilot in their company and that he had lost his uniform. They directed him to a uniform manufacturing company and told him that he could get a new uniform. And indeed, he went to this company and bought a uniform in his size, and the company deducted the price of the uniform from his salary. But he did not start working with them. Then he searched for how to get a pilot's license and discovered the company that manufactures the licenses for Pan Am. Then he contacted that company and told them that he admired the pilot licenses they make for Pan Am, and told them that he had a company and wanted them to make cards for his team. So he asked them to create a card for him with his name and picture just to see its quality. And he really succeeded in convincing them, but they did not give him a complete card like Pan Am card. He added his company logo to it and got a copy that was identical to the company's card. Honestly, it's very strange. In the first few weeks, Frank wandered around in a pilot uniform, carrying his ID card to get to know the place well and get used to the terminology and details related to airports and flights in general. During this period, he continued to cash counterfeit checks in banks by taking advantage of his pilot uniform as a symbol that enhances the trust of the bank and its employees. He was able to enter any bank and cash large amounts of counterfeit checks without any problems, without anyone suspecting him. After Frank learned the aviation terminology and practiced well, he thought about making his first flight. The question that may come to mind is, how did he fly if he was not a pilot? The answer is simply that he used a feature called Dead Hidden. This feature allowed pilots and crew to use free flights to travel to work, but only if there were empty seats available, in addition to free housing provided by this feature. This helped him travel a lot to cash forged checks in different areas. For this reason, they could not trace him even though the bank knew that those checks were forged. He traveled frequently from one country to another and from one region to another, which made it difficult to trace him. This was the best job for him because it made it easy for him to cash forged checks, and at the same time, travel and enjoy his time. The scam continued for 2 years, during which Frank Obagnell was between 16 and 18 years old. During these 2 years, he managed to visit 26 countries and travel on more than 250 flights, covering more than 1.5 million kilometers. After 2 years, the Frank started to become suspicious due to someone filing a complaint that he was impersonating a pilot. Thanks to his cleverness and personality, he was able to convince the person and get away with it. However, he was afraid of being exposed and started to distance himself from that field. Therefore, he started thinking about moving to Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States, and signed a long-term lease for an apartment. When people sign a lease like this, they must clarify their profession, so Frank impersonated a pediatrician and said he was on vacation to finish some important research. Everything was going well, until one day his neighbor, who introduced himself as Dr. William Krieger, a pediatric consultant at Snyder's General Hospital, knocked on his door. Frank was afraid that Krieger would expose him for impersonating a doctor, but luckily Krieger was not the curious type and did not find any problems with him. However, he invited him to visit them at Snyder's General Hospital to get to know him, but Frank managed to avoid the invitation for a while, but he decided to forge a medical certificate from Harvard University. He spent a long time in the public library, where he read about pediatrics and tried to learn more to be ready for any situation or complications that may arise in the profession he had chosen. After several weeks, he felt confident and decided to accept Dr. Kring's invitation and join the General Hospital. He brought his cell phone with him and began to regularly visit the hospital. He became acquainted with many people there and spent time supervising one of the hospital's periodic review tours. Then the hospital director asked him for a big favor, which was to cover a 10-day shift for one of the doctors. The manager said that this doctor's relative has died and he won't be able to attend his shift and that they need a replacement as soon as possible. At first, Frank tried to avoid the subject and pointed out that he didn't have a license to practice medicine in the state of Georgia and that his expertise was limited to California. But the manager responded by saying that he wouldn't have to perform any medical tasks during his night shift and that his job would only be to monitor the nurses and trainee doctors. A committee of 5 doctors will supervise everything. And after that, everything will be facilitated, and there will be no problem in him taking this job. Frank's initial reaction was to reject the offer, as he saw risks associated with the subject, but his nature pushed him to accept the challenge. Indeed, he became the doctor in charge of the night shift in the pediatric department, with 40 nurses and 8 trainee doctors working under his direction. Frank acted in an unconventional way in management, allowing nurses and trainee doctors to deal with cases freely, as if he gave them complete freedom without the need for supervision. In some cases, she needed real medical intervention after the end of the 10-day period, during which the original doctor was supposed to return to perform his duties. She stood before the hospital director, who indicated that the doctor would not return, and asked him to take on this responsibility permanently. Indeed, Frank accepted this job and continued in it for 11 months. He performed a sensitive job like childcare, despite not being a doctor, but he was a supervisor and responsible for the team of doctors, nurses, and night operations. Fortunately, things were going smoothly for a long time until the day Frank was called to the emergency room. He hoped to be one of the resident doctors to help him in this case. 3 resident doctors entered the room around the injured child, and his condition was clearly serious. Frank consulted the resident doctors about their opinion on the case and made a decision based on their opinions. After 11 months, Frank decided to quit his career in medicine and start a new adventure. He had met a woman during his time as a pilot impersonator, and it turned out that she had a degree in law from Harvard University, the highest American legal degree one can obtain. One day, she took him to a party where he met the assistant district attorney, who told them they were looking for talented young lawyers and suggested that he take the bar exam and join the team. Frank decided afterwards to visit Harvard certificate perfectly and prepare seriously for the bar exam. He passed it with flying colors after several weeks of studying and hard work. His wish was fulfilled, and he passed the difficult exam, which lawyers usually take to practice the profession. The only way for him to achieve this was to take the test, and he actually excelled in it exceptionally due to his high intelligence. It is worth noting that he did all of this at the age of 19. He went and worked in the prosecutor's office for a while until he met by coincidence a lawyer who graduated from Harvard University. In fact, he started asking him very detailed questions until Frank was afraid to reveal his lack of knowledge. Therefore, he decided to leave this field and search for another one. After that, he moved to the state of Utah, specifically to Brigham Young University, where he succeeded in deceiving the university and convincing them to appoint him as an assistant professor for a period of 8 months. But to this day, the university still denies this. During these years, Frank was a highly sought-after person by Interpol and the FBI, so he left the United States and fled to Europe. Nevertheless, he continued to write forged checks and engage in fraudulent activities. Unfortunately, he was arrested by Interpol in France due to an arrest warrant issued by Sweden after assuming false identities and cashing forged checks. He spent several months in French prisons, then in Swedish prisons, before being handed over to the United States, where he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. During his detention by the U.S. authorities, he managed to escape twice, but was caught and returned to prison again. After 4 years in prison, he cooperated with the FBI to help them solve fraud cases, especially those related to check forgery. Frank was very skilled in this field and produced counterfeit checks of amazing quality, to the point that check manufacturing companies themselves were amazed by their quality. Frank contributed to solving many cases of fraud to this day. Currently, Frank is 75 years old and has completed his mandatory sentence with the FBI. He has children who work in the same field, and he works as a security expert for many companies. He has provided assistance to many individuals, companies, and institutions through his job, and has accumulated a large fortune worth tens of millions of dollars. In addition, a special film was produced about him in 2002 that speaks about all the events he went through. The film starred Leonardo DiCaprio and was directed by Steven Spielberg, and the film was able to make huge profits of over $1 billion. In the video description, I have provided a link to the lecture article given by Frank on Google, which you can watch if you want to learn more about him. This man is currently very interesting and speaks in a smooth and measured way. You will not be surprised by the things he did in his youth because he was a genius in every sense of the word. It is clear that he has repented and become a completely upright man. This is the end of this wonderful story, and I wish you all happy days. If you like the video, please subscribe and like it.